Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. We're going to give it just a minute for folks to filter in here. Thank you for joining the Student Borrower Protection Center and the UC Student Loan Law Initiative's research showcase today. We will get rolling in just a couple minutes past the top of the hour. While we are waiting for folks to filter in, I'm happy to answer this question that just got dropped in the chat. Yes, a recording of this webinar will be made available later. We will post that on the Student Borrower Protection Center's YouTube page, and we can send the link around to participants, to RSVPs. Let's get started, everybody. Welcome to the UC Student Loan Law Initiative and the Student Borrower Protection Center's showcase of some exciting student debt research by two of our fantastic affiliated scholars. First up, we will hear from Sultana Fazia, who is a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley Law School and works at the Student Loan Law Initiative, along with our friend and economist and longtime collaborator, Marshall Steinbaum, who is an economist professor at University of Utah, and also an affiliate of the Student Loan Law Initiative. They will both offer a brief presentation on their research. At the conclusion of Marshall's presentation, we will take questions from participants. So please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to log your questions at any point during the presentation. We will save them all for the end of both presentations. And if you have any questions as a follow-up, or you're interested in engaging with us or our academic work, feel free to reach out to the Student Borrower Protection Center at SLLI@protectborrowers.org. That's our email address. You can also learn more about the Student Loan Law Initiative at SLLI.org. That's SLLI.org. With that, I'm happy to hand this over to Dr. Fazia, who is going to talk about her exciting new research on the student debt crisis in California.
Thank you, Mike. Just let me share my screens. I hope you can see my screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. So let's start. As Mike mentioned, that I'm Sultana Fazia. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. And today I'm going to talk about our recent data brief on student loan in California, a narrative of racial inequality. We did this paper with my co-authors, Professor Dalia Jimenez from UC Irvine and Professor Jonathan Glater from UC Berkeley. This is a product of our work at Student Loan Law Initiative, SLLI. SLLI is a partnership between Student Borrower Protection Center and the UC Irvine School of Law. And then the main purpose of this initiative was to develop and facilitate other research that address the student loan crisis in general. So let's talk about student debt today. To begin with, the student debt in general is a burden for all the borrowers. It affects our life choices, whether it is purchasing a house, taking a job, starting a new business, sending our kids to schools and colleges, their education. All these life choices are impacted by the student debt that we have. And that essentially affects our opportunities in life as well, whether we have access to other credits, whether we can buy the house with the mortgage, all those things, and eventually the standard of our life in general. We know all these facts, but at the same time, we also have heard that this burden is disproportionately high for the people of color. So from there, the racial aspect comes. In the next few slides, in the next 10, 15 minutes, I will show you our recent analysis and give you some numbers, some figures that goes with this narrative. And you will be able to put those numbers along with this narrative to have a more objective ideas about this whole student debt issues, particularly in California. You may ask why California. So firstly, we have a very detailed data that we have access to through the UCCCP. I will talk a little bit about the data later on. And it has 100% representation of the borrowers in California. The other aspect is that California is one of the top states that share a major share of the student loan, both in terms of balance and borrowers. According to one of the reports by Federal Student Aid from the Department of Education, it's somewhere around 9% in 2022. That's the amount of overall student loan balance that belongs to California. In our analysis, we have found that in 2022, by the end of 2022, around 13% of the adult population in California have at least one student loan. And that means that 4 million people belong to that category. The overall cumulative student loan balance for that period is around $160 billion. On an average, a student borrower in California owe a balance of $39,000. At the same time, we looked around the delinquency, and we figured out that only 40,000 borrowers, that is less than 1% of the borrowers, have a delinquent account, and then the cumulative balance is approximately 1 billion. It sounds low, but then again, we have to keep in mind that we are talking about a period when there was papers. On an average, a student loan borrower in the same time who has a delinquency have a balance of around $27,000. Now, before we go into other details and talk about more about the delinquencies, credit scores, and overall outstanding balance for this population, let's talk about the data a little bit. So for this analysis, we use the data from the University of California Consumer Credit Panel, the UCCCP. So UCCCP has as two data sets. One is for the national, that is 2% sample of the national borrowers. And the other one is that 100% borrowers in California. It has all their credit history. And for this, this is very detailed, and we can identify the zip codes that they belong to. So that helps us to run the analysis at the zip code level. This is probably one of the few studies that can look at those smaller geographic level. Also, we look at only the primary loan recipient who has at least one student loan, and maybe they have other loans as well, but we are only focusing on their student loan outcome. We have quarterly data starting from 2018 till 2022 that gives us 2 periods before the pandemic hit, so before papers. And then we have roughly around 3 years during the papers. And we can observe the outcomes and the difference in the outcomes over this period. As I have mentioned, we run the analysis at the zip code levels. In our analysis, there are 1,700 zip codes we can identify over in California. However, when we try to identify or divided those neighborhoods into white and Latino neighborhoods, we figured out that around 980 zip codes belong to predominantly white neighborhoods, whereas 204 zip codes are predominantly Latino neighborhoods. The racial demographic indicators are from American Community Survey, because we do not have the race indicators otherwise. So now let's talk about the overall delinquency. Let's start with the delinquency in California. This is an overall student loan delinquency and the trend. As you can see, the data started just before the papers. Paper started in March, just to remind you, in March 2020. So any data after that will show the reflection of the impact of those policies. So there is a sudden drop. It is almost around 80% in number of delinquent borrowers, as well as the delinquents balance. This drop is definitely as a result of these papers. Then we try to look at the outcome or the overall status of student borrowers in terms of their at zip code levels in California. We look at the mean and median. So at the beginning of 2018, Q1, we figured out that the average outstanding balance in the zip codes is around 33,000. Over the period of 5 years, there is an 18% increase in this mean outstanding balance, and that gives us around 39,000 on an average student loan balance. Then we look at the median. There's also a rise from 16,000 in 2018. We end up with 19,000 per person outstanding balance in 2022. If we look at the number of borrowers over the period, it didn't fluctuate much, but if we try to look at the zip code level, then there is something we need to focus on. As you can see, there is very little fluctuation in all those diagrams that you can see on your screen. The top one is the average number of borrowers in the Latino zip codes, and the bottom one, the light blue one, is the average number of borrowers in the white neighborhoods. You can see there's very little fluctuations. But what we take away from this graph is that consistently the number of borrowers in Latino neighborhoods is higher, and it is almost 1.8 times higher than the white neighborhoods. Now let's look at the other aspect. So now we are focusing on the number of delinquent borrowers at zip code level over the same period. So here I'm showing you the trend between 2018 till 2020 Q1 before the paper started. So as you can see, the top one, the blue line at the top, is representing the average number of delinquent borrowers in Latino neighborhoods, and the green one is the same aspect in the white zip codes. As you can see, there are some variation, but consistently the number of delinquent borrowers in Latino zip codes is higher. The range is somewhere between 20 to 200 borrowers, but even given that fluctuation, it's persistently they have a higher share of delinquent borrowers. Now, once we reach the Q2 of 2020, then we get to see the impact of the payment pause, and this is the impact. So as you can see, all the disparity in the number of delinquent borrowers is removed just because there is pay pause, and then it is persistent in the next 3 years. We can see the same trend with another graph. Now you can see on your screen is the total delinquent balance per zip code. Again, there are some fluctuations over the period, but again, as soon as we reach the pay pause era, this disparity is removed just simply by this one policy. And next, we try to focus on the delinquency rate. So out of the total borrowers, what is the share of delinquent student borrowers? So we use several measures here. We are the graph is showing is the deep delinquency. That means any borrower with a 90-day past due student accounts, whether they have a loan in collection and whether there is a charge-off. So including all those three, we can see there is a fluctuation in from 2018 to 2022, and the fluctuation is somewhere between 2% to 5%. And then it is removed. We cannot see that difference anymore during the pay pause period. We have repeated the same kind of analysis with a different definition of delinquency. We tried a 30-day delinquency, we tried a 90-day delinquency, and though the numbers are slightly different, but the trend is always the similar. And this is because of the nature of the policy that was implemented at that same time. Now, let's look at the number of, the amount of balance that this neighborhood holds. So far, we have seen that in terms of delinquent borrowers, the share of delinquent balance, these Latino neighborhoods are worse off. What about their outstanding balance? So we look at the top row, if you can see that 42% of the borrowers in Latino neighborhoods, they have a 10,000 or less balance. And in the 33% of the white neighborhoods have 10,000 or less balance. So in terms of that, Latino neighborhoods has smaller balance. If we look at the other spectrum, the big ones, the big balances. So in the Latino neighborhoods, 13% of the Latino neighborhoods have 50,000 or more, whereas 21% of the white zip codes have a balance of 50,000 or more. So it's not that the Latino neighborhoods has more delinquency, but at the same time, this delinquency are probably resulted from very small balances in those accounts. Now, the other aspect that we look at is the average credit score. We know that the credit score increases or decreases slowly over the time but during our study period, we have seen that from 2018 till 2022, overall in the white neighborhood, there is a 1.5% increase in the credit score, whereas there is 2% increase in the credit score in the Latino neighborhoods. But specifically, I will draw your attention to the second quarter of 2022, just after the papers was implemented. There is a sharp hike, and the hike is higher in the Latino neighborhood. We can see the green line. So there is a hike of 1.8% in the Latino neighborhood in terms of credit score, whereas this hike is only 1.3% lower in the white zip code areas. So given all these scenarios, all these things together, what are the takeaways we can have? So the first thing is that during the temporary debt relief that came in form of the papers has improved the borrower's outcome in terms of number of delinquency, balance in delinquency, whether it's the credit score, average balances, in all those aspects, the borrower's outcome has improved. But it also shows us that during our study period, the Latino neighborhood has started worse off than their white counterpart. So this the papers has helped them to have a better outcome out of these papers. So now we are at a point when the payment will resume, or it has resumed. So it will again, the borrower will start their struggle to pay their debts off. We don't know the extent of that as of yet. We don't know how long it will take to show in the data, but those are the things that we must keep in mind. But it is we can say for sure that once the papers is gone, the struggle will come back that they have temporarily for the last 3 years. And the trend also give us an indication that it is reasonable to guess that this struggle would be it will be more harder on the Latino neighborhoods than the white neighborhoods. So yeah, that's the things that we figure out from this analysis. And yeah, that's all from me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I think we are excited to do some Q&A. If folks have questions about Dr. Fauzia's presentation, she will be happy to answer those at the conclusion of our next presentation. And with that, I am happy to hand this off to Marshall.
Hi, thank you, Mike, and everyone at SBPC and SLLI for doing this. So I'm presenting this paper, The Long Run Impact of the Great Recession on Student Debt. This is recently accepted and forthcoming from the journal Labor Economics, which means as an economist, I wouldn't normally present it since in some ways it's done. So no opportunity to make changes from here. But on the other hand, I think the sort of questions that it raises from a policy perspective, as well as in terms of agenda setting for research, are worth kind of highlighting now to set the table for further research to come. So this is joint work with my colleague Sergio Pinto, and I also want to thank my other colleagues at the Jane Family Institute, Laura Beamer and Eddie Nile, who have aided us throughout our getting our feet and then more of our body wet in the credit reporting data. And I'm very excited to be pursuing that as well at SLLI going forward. All right, so the motivation for writing this paper was kind of we got started at I would say early 2021, looking back over the run up in student debt over the period of the 2010s, and in particular, where the response to the Great Recession really centered this idea of job retraining of unemployed workers. The idea was there's some sort of sectoral misallocation of workers in the labor market. And so the way to deal with the labor market slackness coming out of the Great Recession is to cause workers to move from one industry to another. And the way to effectuate that transition is enrollment in higher education and consequently taking on more student debt. So in particular, one aspect of that policy was joint guidance issued by the Obama administration in 2009 after the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which basically directed state unemployment insurance agencies to tell recipients that they should enroll in higher education. Here's the institutions in your area that are eligible and that offer credentials that will suit you for reemployment. So that was kind of letters sent from unemployment agencies to UI recipients. The other half of the guidance was letters sent from the Department of Education to financial aid administrators at institutions, telling them more or less that they should adjust aid awards to take account of lost income thanks to job loss. So basically, make financial aid more generous in light of the recession. There's a previous paper by Barr and Turner that concludes that this guidance, specifically the letters generated by it, caused increase in higher education enrollment of at least 500,000 UI recipients. So in that sense, the guidance was a successful policy. The aim was to increase enrollment, and it did in fact do that. So we're kind of looking at the long aftermath of that. We use the same methodology as previous publications that investigated the long-term impact of the Great Recession on employment and earnings, so really kind of labor-focused study. And those studies conclude that job loss and earnings loss lasted much longer than the recession itself. So there's sort of this long aftermath, what economists call hysteresis. But the most recently published of them definitely conclude that the effects of the Great Recession started to dissipate by the end of the 2010s. So in that sense, our finding is at odds with that, and I would interpret it as in effect, the Great Recession was a temporary event that disrupted the labor market and caused people to have lower earnings than they would have otherwise. The direct effect on the labor market was transitory, although long-lasting, but the effect on student debt was not transitory, at least through 2019, as this paper documents. So we see people take on more student debt and basically, keep it. They don't pay it back. So we investigate. So the sort of first aim of the study is to document the effect of the Great Recession on student indebtedness, and then the second aim is to try to investigate the channels by which the Great Recession would have increased student indebtedness and non-repayment. So we look at direct effect on borrower financial status. For example, if you lost a job, then your household income will deteriorate and be less able to pay back pretty much any debt. So we look at that. Look at labor market credentialization. So that phrase refers to increased educational attainment required for any given job or salary. And there's a couple of prior studies of the labor market impact of the Great Recession that shows this credentialization effect quite starkly, that when labor markets were more slack directly during and after the Great Recession, employers demanded higher levels of educational attainment conditional on the job that they were advertising for. We also look at state fiscal policy, pro-cyclical state fiscal policy, namely reductions in funding to public institutions during and after the Great Recession that causes them to shift towards a more tuition-centric business model, which is going to rely on people taking out more student loans and larger student loans. And then finally, we look at the entry and expansion of the for-profit higher education sector and how that responds to the Great Recession. Okay, so I've already kind of forecast what the findings are. I'm going to forecast them again before showing you a bunch of charts. Great Recession associated with higher loan balances, greater likelihood of delinquency and default, and lower likelihood of repaying student loans. And we find evidence consistent with all of the channels that I mentioned on the previous slide. Borrowers more affected by the Great Recession were more likely to have any loan in bankruptcy. We take that as our indicator of sort of the status of your own household finances. So that would lead to more difficulty with repayment. Recession caused student debtors to take on additional debt associated with enrollment. So this is, I think, an important kind of methodological contribution of this paper is using the credit reporting data to try to basically guess attainment, because we don't observe educational attainment very well in the credit reporting data. So this is an issue using credit reporting data for student loan research. And in this paper, we've identified the types of loans in the data that we think are associated with additional attainment as opposed to refinancing or something of that nature. Taking on such a loan that signifies increased attainment is then associated with a significant increase in the probability of delinquency and non-repayment in the subsequent year. So pretty much, it's not literally true that all the findings of our paper are driven by the people who re-enrolled, but they have much, much worse outcomes in terms of student indebtedness later in the decade than borrowers who did not re-enroll. So in that sense, we kind of take a different view of that guidance, of the aforementioned guidance. It caused increase in attainment, but there was a lot of follow-on consequences of that is more or less the message of this paper. Higher ed institutions that are located where the Great Recession was most severe suffered a more pronounced decline in state and local funding per enrollee. And so that increased student borrowing within institutions and also increased the number of students who take out student loans within each institution. So I want to make the point that within institution effect understates the overall Great Recession effect, because one thing that happens in the Great Recession is, first of all, the credentialization channel wouldn't necessarily be measured as increases in loan balance within institutions, because that is measured degree program by degree program. So if you take more than one degree but take out the median student loan for each degree that you take out, each degree that you obtain, it's not going to look like the within institution student loan amount is increasing, and yet it is, because the same student has more degrees and therefore more student debt. And then there's also an increase in institutional segregation in higher education, which I will show some evidence of in a few minutes. And so that's going to channel the kind of channel more students into higher cost programs. I suspect channel kind of negatively select students into the higher cost programs. So the ones who would be least able to absorb increase in amount of student debt are the ones who most have to take it on. And then finally, the geographies where the recession was most severe had a disproportionate entry and expansion of for-profit institutions and a corresponding decline in enrollment in public institutions. So I think those of us who are in the weeds of higher education policy aren't surprised to hear that, because we saw the pattern of the kind of predatory for-profit sector expand during and after the Great Recession. We know where that happened, but it is striking to see that kind of play out in both the IPEDS data that we use and the credit reporting data. All right, so what we're working with here is a panel of student loan borrowers from Credit Reporting Bureau Experian. This is borrowers in 2009, so we sample them in 2009 and then follow them for subsequent 10 years through 2019 and observe them annually, regardless of whether they still have student debt. So if you pay off your student debt, you're still in the panel going forward. But the point of this analysis is pretty much these are all student debtors. They start as student debtors in the panel. So this is why one outstanding question from this research is, what would it mean for subsequent student debtors who were not yet student debtors in 2009? Are they going to be worse off or better off than this cohort of people who already had student debt kind of when the Great Recession hit? We observe both individual consumer level data as well as loan level data, and we observe all loans in a credit report for individuals in the panel. So not surprising if you're familiar with the structure of these credit panels, but I just want to sort of put that out there in case people aren't. The crucial aspect of the data for the purpose of being able to undertake this study is that we observe geographic location, and then this methodology that studies the long-term impact of the Great Recession uses variation across local geographies and the severity of the Great Recession in order to estimate the effect of the overall macroeconomic shock. And so since we observe where student borrowers were located in 2009, we can in effect use that same methodology to estimate it. So here's the kind of raw data from the overall panel. As I said, everyone's a student debtor starting in 2009. So the way this chart works is that starting student loan balance in 2009 is designated as a 1. That is to say, we're measuring whether you have more or less student debt than you did when we first observed you in 2009. And then what you can see here is basically the fanning out of the ratio of current balance to original balance across the following decades. So some borrowers, we were sampling 1 million student borrowers in 2009. Some of them were probably very near repayment when they're first observed, and in fact did ultimately end up repaying. In fairly short order. Others took on more debt thereafter. So we're going to talk a lot about that, as I alerted earlier. And so you can see the 75th percentile and the 90th percentile of borrowers have rising balances over this time. And I would kind of highlight that the repayment period for most federal student loans is supposed to be 10 years. So you would, barring the people who did re-enroll and take on more student debt thereafter, you should expect everyone to go to zero within 10 years at least. And some of these people had already been in repayment for a while when we first observed them, so they should go to zero faster. So we already see from this chart that the system is not causing people to fully repay their student loans in the kind of standard repayment window. And pretty much the aim of this entire study is to say, okay, well, we have this variation in repayment in this one borrower cohort. To what degree is this variation explained by variation in the Great Recession shock? And that is indeed the question we're about to answer. All right, here's a map of the Great Recession shock. This is the change in unemployment rate at the commuting zone levels. This is like a local labor market concept that the government puts out. And here we've shaded it basically how bad was the Great Recession in your commuting zone. And so you can kind of get a sense of the geography of the Great Recession from here. This is our right-hand side variable in terms of explaining all the outcomes related to student debt and higher education that we'll get to in a second. All right, so summary statistics. Ultimately, we've got 787,000 borrowers in the sample. This is because of the million, some people, the way it works, some people are already rolled out. Others, we in theory observe them, but we don't actually see what their student loan balance is. So since all of these outcomes are premised on being able to observe student loan balance, those are also dropped. So it's not quite a million in the event. I forget if I said this earlier, that there's an age limit for the student debtors to begin with. It's 18 to 34. So within that, the average age in 2009 was 28. So you can think of most of the people in the sample as people who are pretty much done with higher education during the Great Recession. Although, as we'll see, there's an effect in terms of kind of returning to the system thereafter. Average loan balance is almost the same, or I guess it's a little over $1,000 difference between 2009 and 2019. But that mass a huge amount of heterogeneity, which you can pretty much guess from the previous chart. That is to say, you've got some people with much higher loan balances 10 years later, and then some people who fully repaid their loans and are down to zero. We calculate that of this cohort, 46% had fully repaid 10 years out. Again, that's supposed to be the full term of federal student loans. So, in some sense, that should be a higher number. And then 38% of the sample was ever delinquent on student loans at any time during the 10-year study. All right, so I won't go too much into the weeds on the regression specification. Basically, we've got the change in unemployment rate on the right-hand side. That's this shock variable, and then outcome variables I will list on the following slide. I think the covariates are somewhat interesting here. So first of all, I should say, first of all, we're going to estimate different effects of the Great Recession shock year by year. So you'll see a bunch of coefficient plots in the coming slides that basically say how is the effect of the Great Recession either growing or shrinking over time after it's over. We define, so the aspect of the covariates that I think is worthy of discussion is defining cohort by the origination years of loans in the sample. So this is a pretty stark definition of cohort because it's saying that you're only being compared to individuals who had their oldest student loan taken out in the same year as you, and also their youngest student loan taken out in the same year as you. So that already is going to explain a lot of variation in the data. But I think, that kind of gets rid of a lot of the concerns you would have about apples to oranges comparison in terms of age and cohort effects when being treated by the Great Recession, because you would expect it to have different effects on people who are still in school versus people who are not still in school when the recession hit. The way this is normally done, I suggest in student loan research is to define cohorts by the year in which a borrower entered repayment. And we don't want to do that because we think that is an endogenous outcome, is a very strongly endogenous outcome. We want to study the effect of the Great Recession on basically deferring the year that you entered repayment, either because you can't repay or because you take on more debt and consequently kind of push that into the future. So that's why we didn't do that standard thing. And I think that given, we do find what amounts to endogenous effect of this, economic circumstances, broadly speaking, on entry into repayment, that kind of highlights whether that methodological choice is really robust and potentially shouldn't be adopted going forward. Okay. Right, so we have a bunch of outcomes. The one I've been highlighting so far is just the total student loan balance, and we're going to measure that as changed since 2009. So this kind of filters out any level effect on student indebtedness cohort by cohort. Like, for example, even before 2009, there had been increases in tuition. So you would expect that younger borrowers would have more student debt just for that reason. But we kind of take the starting balance as one of our regressions of interest. So we're only explaining variations in student loan balance subsequent to 2009 through this analysis. We use an indicator for taking out a re-enrollment loan. Again, this is going to be our model of our measure of increased attainment. And in the data, we define a re-enrollment loan as a new student loan that's deferred when it's first observed. So that's a feature of the federal student loan system, whereas refinancing loans would not be deferred when they're first observed. So we're putting some reliance on that indicator as well as just the date on which new loans are originated. Our other outcomes, indicator for completing repayment on all student loans, indicator for bankruptcy on any credit on any loan in a credit record, total balance on delinquent student loans, share of total student loan balance that is delinquent, and an indicator for student loan delinquency. All right, so now you get a bunch of coefficient plots. This is the main one, student loan balance, and you can see the effect of the Great Recession. So the way to interpret this is having a 1 percentage point higher increase, or 1 percentage point larger increase in unemployment in the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009 is associated with an X dollar increase in student loan balances in subsequent years. So the effect by the end of the sample is like something like $370 in student loans. That's 10 years after the Great Recession hit. And the point I would make in sort of looking at this pattern of coefficients is the studies of hysteresis related to the Great Recession start to show a decline in the Great Recession effect around 2015, 2016. So you see this sort of long lasting but not permanent effect of the Great Recession that starts to diminish. But that is not the case for student debt. So there's no sign of it diminishing before 2019. We don't have data, at least for this study, after 2019. I suspect it would start to diminish if I did have data then, thanks to the repayment pauses we just saw from Fauzia that exerted a very significant influence on student loan balances. And in fact, I've included some slides about that in this presentation as well. So for that reason, I would have thought the Great Recession effect would diminish after 2019, but not because the effect of the Great Recession itself kind of dissipated. And indeed, we have no evidence of that. All right, so here's a map of that. It's not exactly the same as the geography of the Great Recession shock. As you can see, the sort of big increases in loan balances are concentrated in the Southeast. In the Great Recession shock, we saw that and the kind of West Coast being the most affected area. So there's some interesting kind of geographic variation here that's probably masking, I think, variations in higher education policy, if I had to guess, at the state level, as kind of the reason why some regions responded with higher student indebtedness and others not. So here's our re-enrollment outcome, and you know, the most salient feature of this is this increase in re-enrollment in the kind of couple of years after the Great Recession. So this is saying that being more shocked by the Great Recession is associated with higher probability of having a re-enrollment loan in these years, you know, 2010 or so to 2013, 2014, and then it diminishes kind of back down to baseline. So this is, you know, kind of our main indicator of the credentialization channel, I would call it, which is, you know, you need more higher education in order to qualify yourself for a given job, and consequently you take out more student loans in order to do that. And of course, since your salary hasn't changed, you're sort of vying for scarce job opportunities. That increased student debt doesn't come along with an increase in pay that would enable you to repay it. So the sort of mechanism by which the student loan system is supposed to be self-financing just doesn't work that way. I'll show later, kind of trying to explain these negative coefficients right at the start of the period, because that's somewhat interesting itself. All right, so effect on the probability of completing repayment. This is, you know, have you repaid all? As I said, everyone is a student debtor at the beginning, and the question is do you still have student debt outstanding in each of these subsequent years? If you're located in a place that was more shocked by the Great Recession, it's less likely that you've completed repayment on all your student loans, and that continues through the end of the panel. This is the effect on the bankruptcy indicator. So that gets most severe in the early 2010s and then starts to diminish by the end, but doesn't ever get back to zero. So places that were more affected by the Great Recession are more likely to have loans in bankruptcy. And then finally, the effect on the total student loan balance and delinquency, that takes a little longer to kick in because people have to take on student debt in the first place in order to have that student debt then become delinquent. But there's definitely a pronounced recession effect on delinquency through the mid-2010s. My interpretation of the fact that these coefficients eventually become negative is basically that the income-driven repayment programs worked as intended, which is to say halted the cycle of delinquency and instead put loans into a status of accumulating balances because you didn't have payments due. They just got added to principal. So it's kind of like, okay, well, we'll kick the can down the road towards improved IDR programs. I mean, that's going beyond really what I can definitively say from the data, because I don't see IDR enrollment. And that's a sort of ongoing research question for everyone using credit reporting data to study student debt, is that you don't actually, you have to sort of guess about who's enrolled in income-driven repayment. You don't actually know. Okay, so I see someone in the chat has asked whether the shock is randomly assigned. So I've got a couple charts that try to convince you that it is. So in the credit panel, we do not observe these borrowers before the Great Recession, so it's not possible to test for the existence of differential pre-trends, and consequently we move to the college scorecard. So this is not quite as good because the college scorecard is only telling us about institutions. Now the whole premise is we link student borrowers to the institution they attended, but still the outcome of interest is at the institution level, not at the individual borrower level for all of these charts. But basically what we try to do is go back before the recession, because the college scorecard goes back to 2001, and say, okay, were the places that were more shocked by the Great Recession, did they have more student debt to begin with, or something like that? And this suggests not. So we've got two outcomes of interest that are relevant here. One is median student loan balance at the institution level. As I said, even though I was saying at the institution level, it's really at the degree program by institution level. And also this is only computed among people who have student debt to begin with. So this median loan balance is of student debtors in a given institution degree program, what's the amount of student debt that they take out. And we can see it doesn't look like that amount is closely related to the Great Recession effect kind of before the Great Recession actually happened. But then after it happened, we confirmed the positive coefficients that we showed from the credit reporting data. Now, a couple points about this college scorecard analysis. So these coefficient sizes are smaller than what we saw in the credit reporting data. That is not too surprising, at least in my opinion, because within institution degree program cells are like that's just going to understate the effect of the Great Recession if borrowers are enrolling in more degree programs, so sort of taking on debt at more stages of their higher education career that will necessarily show up within a institution by degree program. And then also if borrowers are being reallocated from institutions that have on average lower student debt to institutions that have on average higher student debt, that aspect of the increase in recession-driven student debt is not going to be captured by these college scorecard variables either. So that's what I would call institutional segregation, just to be clear about that. So for both of those reasons, I'm not surprised that the college scorecard data understates the Great Recession effect that we document in the credit reporting data. Okay, so as I said, this is median student loan balance for student borrowers. This is the number of people in each institution borrower cohort. So it's like we compute the median over all the student borrowers, and this is saying how many borrowers we're computing the median over. For that outcome, it's kind of even stronger effect of the Great Recession. So, seemingly no relationship before, but in the size of the median borrower cohort, you can think of this as the count of student debtors within each institution by degree program. That's not related to the geography of the Great Recession beforehand, but afterward, you can see the Great Recession has a major effect on the count of student borrowers within each institution by degree program. All right. Say a little bit more about the mechanisms here. And sorry, I realize I'm going on a little bit long, but it's my work, so I get to talk about it as long as I want, I guess. The first outcome I want to talk about is this re-enrollment again. So this is just the sort of summary statistic of what share of borrowers in this panel re-enroll over time. And if you just looked at this chart and you knew that we were talking about a constant panel of borrowers that was between the ages of 18 to 34 in 2009, if you just the qualitative shape of this is not surprising at all, because some of those people were still enrolled in undergraduate when they're first observed, so they're likely to re-enroll as we define it. That is to say, go back to college for another year, take out another student loan to pay for it. And then as that sort of cohort of that constant cohort of a given age group, gets older, they're going to be less and less likely to be involved in the higher education sector. So, it's not, again, not surprising to see this peak just short of 8% in the earlier years, and then a steady decline to about 3% following the later years. And this is, borrowers who are over the age of 23, the probability or the share of them that has a re-enrollment loan in the previous year, in the year leading up to the point that is plotted on this diagram. So again, as with all of these summary statistics plots, the question is, to what degree does the Great Recession explain variation among borrowers in this case, re-enrollment? And here's where we get some of the interesting results about the pattern of the Great Recession. So the top panel here is borrowers who are under 23 in 2009. We see for the first couple of years, the the size of the recession shock has a negative influence on how likely they were to re-enroll. This is interesting to me. So my interpretation of this would be basically people were more likely to drop out of college during the Great Recession. Basically, I would guess because they couldn't pay for it, or they had lost their job or something like that. It's been pointed out to me by referees that that's not, we can't directly say that because people could have finished their degrees more quickly. So it's not necessarily a statement about non-completion, but I would guess that that's mostly driven by non-completion. And it's also consistent. One inconsistency between my paper and some of the other work about hysteresis was one of those papers shows that places that were more shocked by the Great Recession had lower educational attainment on the whole. So I'm showing all this stuff about re-enrollment and credentialization. That seems to be a story of higher educational attainment, but this is basically saying that idea of overall effect on attainment is very much age delimited. So for the people who are kind of, you can think of them as still undergrads when they're first observed, they're less likely to continue re-enrolling. That is to say, drop out of undergrad, or at least not complete, with the caveat that I just gave. Whereas people who are over 23 in 2009, they're the ones who are most likely to re-enroll in the subsequent years. So this is why, it's not a direct evaluation of the guidance of the Obama guidance that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, but it does kind of seem to suggest again that guidance had its intended effect of causing people to enroll in higher education, to go back to school, and retrain in principle for the labor market, so consequently they did in places that were more harmed by the Great Recession. So here's summary statistics differentiating the people who we observe ever having taken out a re-enrollment loan versus not doing that. So 28% of the sample at some point takes out what we call a re-enrollment loan, 72% doesn't. They're pretty similar ex ante. So 1 year younger on average take out a re-enrollment loan. Again, if you expected all the re-enrollment to be driven by people completing their undergraduate degrees, this age difference between the two groups should be bigger than 1 year, in my opinion. So the fact that they're pretty similar in terms of age says, the re-enrollment effect wasn't just people continuing their undergrad. And in fact, what we saw about the youngest borrowers there says the effect of the Great Recession was actually to stop people from continuing an undergraduate after the Great Recession. So we're talking about people older than undergraduate by and large when we're talking about this re-enrollment outcome. There's some increase, some increment in student debt in 2009 between the re-enrolled group and the never re-enrolled group. I suspect that's again because the re-enrolled group is somewhat younger, so that means that they would have been in higher education at a time when tuition was higher. But those sort of small differences in loan balances in 2009 are blown up enormously by 2019. So here, basically the people who never re-enrolled paid down their student loan balances. 59% had completed repayment by 2019. By contrast, the people who did re-enroll, only 13% had completed repayment by 2019, and they had an average of an average loan balance of $50,000 at the last time they were observed. So re-enrolling caused people to take out more student debt and also not to pay it back. That might not be too surprising if you think, okay, well, of course, taking out more student loans means you have more student debt. In that sense, it is, not a very shocking outcome to document that. On the other hand, the premise of the guidance was basically taking out more student debt will cause you to be in a better situation financially, so you should be able to repay your student loans. That is, kind of premised on this idea that the student loan system is self-financing, and I think this paper shows pretty definitively that that's not the case. So people take out more student debt thanks to re-enrollment, and then they never pay it back. And in fact, it just keeps accumulating from there, as we'll see in a moment, I think. Yes, here. So this is the same coefficient plot I showed earlier that had the overall sample. What's the dynamic effect of the Great Recession on balances? Here we divide it into the re-enrolled group and the not re-enrolled group. So the top panel is people who never re-enrolled. There you see the Great Recession effect peaks in 2012 to 2013 and then diminishes, though it never goes to zero, but it's not widening over time. The bottom group is the re-enrollment group. Note the vertical axis scale is like 10 times as large for this re-enrollment group, and you can see that's just steadily increasing over time. So we saw the re-enrollment base itself really only happened in like 2011 to 2014, but the student debt kept growing thereafter. And this is why I characterize this finding as saying a sort of temporary event that permanently put these borrowers on a different trajectory. That is, I would guess that they're enrolled disproportionately in income-driven repayment. Consequently, they're not ever making payments. So this is why we get to these very high loan balances for that group the longer we go on, until, of course, the pandemic repayment pause comes into effect. Okay, and I'll finish up here on this paper with the study of state funding and segregation within the higher education system. So now we're back in IPED's college scorecard world, where this is all about institutional variables, not borrower level variables. This time series is showing the state and local funding per enrollee in the entire college scorecard data. So you can see that drops between 2009 and 2012 from 8,500 to 7,500, reflecting pro-cyclical state fiscal policies resulting in funding cuts for public higher ed. Then we see some rebound. In fact, I found it surprising that this line actually goes, kind of shows a full rebound and indeed higher funding now than there was before the Great Recession. I had this idea that basically state funding is a ratchet where you cut it and then you never restore it, but that seems to not be the case, at least by this measure. So that's kind of an interesting subject for further research, in my opinion. So here's the effect of the Great Recession on the state and local funding. You can see the places more impacted by the Great Recession have larger declines in state funding relative to 2009 than places that were less affected by the Great Recession, at least through most of the 2010s. And then you can see some restoration of funding. So the fact that the coefficients are above zero says those places that had the most funding withdrawn at least had in those years a bigger rebound. But even though we saw that overall the funding situation is like more than fully rebounded, I would guess that these positive coefficients in these later years don't fully offset the decline in funding for the places that were most negatively affected by the Great Recession. Here's a count of institutions by type, again from IPED. So, pretty constant number of public and private nonprofit institutions, but the for-profit sector had, as a lot of us have documented in great detail, a sort of bubble effect of growing and then eventually shrinking in the later part of the 2010s. But the idea here is basically for-profit higher education institutions are student debt factories. So the more of them there are and the larger share of enrollment they account for, the more student debt the overall higher education system is going to be producing. And again, we see a positive recession effect on the number of for-profits in a local area. So that pretty much never goes away, although you can see sort of the same qualitative pattern over time as in the overall count of for-profit institutions. This is enrollment at for-profit institutions. That's higher in places that were more impacted by the Great Recession, and enrollment at public institutions starts higher in more places that are impacted by the Great Recession. So the recession caused an influx of people into higher education through the re-enrollment channel that we talked about, but also a decline and increased non-completion for younger borrowers. So that's why I would say the combination of those two things is why you get positive coefficients in the first 2 years, but then the effect of the funding cuts would be to restrict the availability of enrollment in public institutions and also increase the cost of that. So basically, increased tuition would displace students who would have attended publics into for-profits, or at least that would be my interpretation of these findings. And that hasn't rebounded. So still lower enrollment at public institutions in the places that were more affected by the Great Recession shock. All right, so let me conclude with a little discussion here. Great Recession caused a big run-up in student debt, especially among borrowers who re-enrolled. The mechanisms that we confirm are labor market credentialization, pro-cyclical state fiscal policy, and consequent entry of an expansion of for-profit institutions. I would say the big research question coming out of this, and this kind of is what ties together Fauzia's presentation with mine, is the Great Recession effect really a cohort effect that will dissipate over time, or does it get worse from there? I think there's some, starting to be some evidence that borrowers who graduated in the late 2010s before the onset of the pandemic and the repayment pause were doing a little bit better than borrowers who graduated in the Great Recession or re-enrolled thereafter. So here I'm thinking of paper, The Lost Generation by Jesse Rothstein. I only recently found out about this paper, which is kind of surprising, but I think is nicely consonant with the interpretation that we're putting forward, which is, if you graduate into a healthier labor market, you don't need as much higher education credentials in order to get a job, which means you don't need as much student debt. So those younger borrowers in that sense, or different cohort of borrowers, is going to end up in a better financial position. And then the repayment pause itself was kind of a sea change in the economics of student debt, as Fausia showed us in enormous detail. So, kind of after that, it's like, okay, well, we're in a whole other world where once you have student loans, it's not the case that the balance is going to be increasing over time, which turns, that's a crucial effect of the repayment pause. All right, just to sort of lay out bigger research questions than just sort of, is the Great Recession effect a cohort effect that's transient or a permanent worsening of the student debt system? I just sort of want to set the table for future research by saying, I think part of what's being documented in the period that we focus on in the recession paper is the changing political economy of higher education. Institutions are dependent on open-ended federal lending, and consequently, that bespeaks a very different institutional set of priorities. So creating master's programs where they can charge high tuition that aren't bound by student loan limits, and basically trying to get as many students to enroll in them as possible. And I think now we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that shift in higher education, where on the one hand, the strong labor market means people don't need credentializing master's programs because they're not vying over scarce jobs to the degree that they were after the Great Recession, but the institutions are very dependent on them. So I think that's probably a source of stress for the people who have to budget for higher education institutions going forward. Also, there's, I would say, overwhelming incentives on the institutional side for institutional segregation. So that means, as we were previously discussing, basically try to appeal to the students who can pay the highest net tuition within any one institution. And typically that will mean displacing students from who can't pay the full sticker price tuition from less expensive institutions to more expensive institutions. So I feel like this has been lost in a lot of the literature on financial aid, some of which shows increasingly generous packages, kind of conditional on admission. But on the other hand, this mechanism of institutional segregation is going to be that for institutions that can offer generous financial aid packages, they're going to have a strong incentive to offer them to fewer students and to displace more students into more expensive institutions where that type of financial aid is not available. And then finally, and this is kind of setting up this conference that SLLI and SBPC are running in a couple months on employer-driven debt. My interpretation of all of student debt is that it's employer-driven debt. That's how I got into studying labor market credentialization. Indeed, I am a labor economist who came from that perspective into student debt. And I think if it's true that employer-driven debt impairs labor market mobility by making each borrower more dependent on any one employer, less able to take better job offers, that's going to suppress competition throughout the labor market and reduce wages. And so consequently, the whole idea of kind of shifting the higher education system to be dependent on student debt was premised on there being a college wage premium. So, this is why it would be the case that the student loan system is self-financing. If it's true that the student loan system itself suppresses earnings of people with student debt and throughout the labor market in general, we're not going to experience that college earnings premium to the same degree, and consequently, it's going to make it very difficult to repay student loans. So I think that kind of intersection of the student loan system and the state of competition in the labor market is, I would say, probably my main research question going forward for a long time to come. Okay, I took the opportunity to shove in something else, which is a study of the repayment pause in here. So I think I'll just do that because it won't take very long. This is based on a Jane Fenley Institute publication from a couple months ago, which is basically asking, did the repayment pause alleviate what we had previously called the crisis of non-repayment, that is, rising balances across a larger number of borrowers with never observing kind of borrowers get a handle on repayment and sort of round the bend, so to speak, towards ever getting their balances down to zero. So yes, is our answer. The repayment pause actually did cause more student loan repayment overall in the system, which is kind of surprising. But if you think about it, not surprising at all when you think about the structure of the what the policy actually was, because it stopped the balances rising on loans where borrowers hadn't been making full payments on their interest pre-pandemic. So that's the mechanism that kind of causes the opposite of repayment, that is rising balances over time. And if you shut off that mechanism, then you're going to have the predominant mechanism being the borrowers that do make progress towards repayment over time. So the overall sort of repayment status of the bulk of student loans got better as a result of the repayment pause coming into effect, or specifically the provision that unpaid interest does not accumulate into balances. Oh, the other thing, the reason I wanted to bring it up in this presentation is, there's been a couple of different studies at this point that focus on what effect did the repayment pause have. We take a slightly different approach than all of them, at least to my knowledge. That is, we categorize loans as being subject to the repayment pause based on their loan balance over time, as opposed to the monthly payments, because we think there's issues in the credit reporting data with that monthly payments variable. And so consequently, it's more accurate to look at what happens to balances, and you can tell that a loan is definitely affected by the repayment pause if it had an increasing balance over time, and then once the pause goes into effect, it either has a stagnant or decreasing balance. So here's a breakdown of the JFI student loan cross-section in 2020 and 2022 based on the status of, or I should say, repayment status. So you can see in 2020, that is to say before the pause went into effect, that you had kind of not quite equal, but a split between loans where balances were decreasing over time, loans where balances were increasing over time. And when the repayment pause was in effect, you had the total collapse of the balance increasing category, and instead a growth of the balance stagnant category. You also had a decline in the making progress category, that is to say decreasing balances over time. So the kind of question, I mean, there was this, I would say the debate over the repayment pause when it was in effect kind of presumed that in the absence of the repayment pause, student loans would be repaid. What we've shown is no, when in the absence of the repayment pause, student loans are not repaid. In fact, their balance is increasing. The effect of the repayment pause is to instead have those unrepaid balances staying stagnant at zero. I should say we included these loans with zero balance. We're currently working on refining these measures of who had their loans canceled, of people who, or of loans that show a zero balance. Is that because they were refinanced? Is that because they were repaid? Is that because they were canceled? So we should have more work in the coming months that analyzes that and then says what's the effect of having your student loans canceled. So this shows the kind of evolution of the repayment status by loan age between 2012 and 2022. This hump is what you are supposed to see in the student loan system now. Even by 2012, I would say the hump is higher and further to the right than it should be. So the reason why you expect a hump is because the loans can increase in balance while they're in deferment. I think, well, certain types of loans can increase their balance when they're in deferment. So there's a lot of loans where if they're very young, you expect them to have higher balance than when they were first originated. Then the borrower enters repayment and they start going down in balance, hopefully to zero. You can see here there's major racial disparities in non-repayment of student debt going back to 2012. Again, Fauzi alluded to this in her presentation, but the qualitative shape of all of these distributions is what is supposed to be the case. That is, as the loan gets older after this initial hump, you do see them go down towards zero. The fact that they're not reaching zero by, I guess it would be 10 years after entering repayment, says, okay, we're still going to have a big, even without the intervening years, we're still going to have a big problem with non-repayment of student debt. However, by the time we get to 2022, we don't even see the outer part of the hump anymore. There's just basically stagnant balances. The reason why these earlier years are so much lower than they were in 2012 is because of the repayment pause. So these loans were born during the repayment pause when loans weren't increasing in balance at all. So it's not possible to have the loan have a higher balance than it did when it was first originated. But then later, so these loans, between ages 3 and 10 they were born before the repayment pause. They accumulated some balance after they were born, and then they definitely have not been repaid. So they just have a very high share of balances that are greater than they were in origination. So show you some effect of the repayment pause in the panel. This is kind of what motivates my statement that the repayment pause is the best thing that ever happened for student loan repayment. Here's different repayment trajectories by race. So you can see non-repayment is worse for Black and Latino borrowers, better for white and Asian borrowers, but not great for anyone because no one's anywhere near zero after 10 years in the panel. But at least the white and Asian borrowers have declining balances on average over time. The reason why the repayment pause was good for repayment is because you see these rising balances kind of round the bend and start declining after the repayment pause goes into effect. And again, this is because the rising balance aspect of unpaid interest went away while the repayment pause was enforced. So same idea by gender. Men show some progress towards repayment, albeit not to zero. Women show no progress towards repayment until the repayment pause goes into effect, and then you start to see it decline. And if the repayment pause continued for indefinitely into the future, hopefully these lines would continue going down. Of course, the repayment pause just ended, so I expect to see all of these lines start to go back up as a result of rising balances on repayable student debt. And consequently, we did a little bit of impact evaluation of the repayment pause using various outcomes. Here, the definition of treatment is whether you had a loan that went from growing balance to stagnant balance, according to the schema I showed earlier of the time series of these loan trajectories. And we compare these outcomes for those two groups and generally show, Fauzia's results showed very strongly that the repayment pause is good for everyone, and this confirms that. But it was especially good for the people who were affected by it, who had loans go from growing to zero balance. And we can see, probably the biggest effect is in this what we call first-time home buyer category. So people who are observed to have a mortgage who've never been seen to have a mortgage before, they have the largest disproportionate increase among those people who's were relieved of growing balances on their student loans. And more on this to come, I would presume. All right, I will stop there. Sorry for dragging on for so long.
I'm on mute, so hi. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Fausia, for presenting that amazing research. I had a question, maybe if I could take my prerogative and ask one first. Marshall, jumping back earlier in your presentation, you looked at the decline, like what you attribute to state disinvestment and then the rebound of state investment in public higher ed. I noticed on those two charts that was per FTE state contribution. Do you imagine that some of what you're seeing in that bump is declining enrollment and like fixed investment in public colleges versus
that's quite possible.
Schools actually targeting there?
Yeah, I mean, I expect that for the sort of credentialization reasons I was saying earlier, that enrollment would have been going down in the later 2010s, and so consequently that ratio could be going up for that reason. So, good point.
Yeah, I also had kind of was surprised by that. I had imagined it being a ratchet, so I was.
Well, more definitely we'll be looking into this more to come.
And it looks like I think Marshall, this is a question for you too. That's in the Q&A. That's one last one. Mm-hmm. But I don't know which slide that was about.
Are you talking about? Are we going to see the same effect with the COVID?
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a very different effect. I mean, actually, that's a great question because one of the referees of this paper asked in revision, do you expect the same thing to happen in this pandemic? And I can't answer that question strictly speaking because I don't have data for the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, because the aftermath of the COVID pandemic hasn't really happened, or at this point has only barely happened. But I suspect it's going to be very different, both because the repayment pause was in effect and because in general, the overall policy response to this recession was very different from the last one. So I view this whole paper as being kind of an evaluation of the at least labor based response to the previous recession and showing it's wanting, at least on the student debt count. Like, it kind of had this whole unintended consequences of blowing up the student loan system. I think the policy response to the most recent recession was way better, both on the student loan side and in general, and consequently we do not see, the labor market was strong pretty much throughout the pandemic. I therefore would think that there's less credentialization in it as a result of that, and consequently less run up in student debt. And I think the numbers that we already have show declining originations of new student loans in the last couple of years. And seemingly people can get a job without having to go into enormous student debt to do it, at least more so than was the case in the last recession. So I expect in 10 years, where I come back to SLLI, SBPC, and do another one of these Zoom presentations with more gray hair, at that point I'll be able to do a comprehensive comparison of the two recessions and show definitively that the more recent recession had a better policy response.
We can't wait. Save the date, everybody. And then Marshall, you had a question for Fazia. I don't know if you wanted to ask that.
Yes.
We don't have any others
yeah. So you showed an increase in the borrower. Actually, it gets to the question I just answered. Increase in borrower count in the most recent quarter. I was surprised at that, because what I have seen, and I haven't looked at the most recent quarter, is declining originations of student loans in for most of the pandemic. So I'm curious if you were surprised by that, and if you've looked into it.
Yeah. It was kind of like we were not expecting that, just to be put in this way. So what we started, at the beginning of the pay pause, we start showing the level of the number of borrowers is decreasing for all three groups that we focused on. But at the end of this period, there is the average number increases in all those categories. But the thing is that the number in the absolute number is not that high. So it's somewhere around 50 people or 100 people. But but we see that, and more surprisingly, the number is higher in the Latino neighborhoods. So there are I don't know for sure, but one reason could be that people are getting back to the schools more.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason for the enrollment decline was during the pandemic wasn't just that there was less credentialization on the labor market, but just people didn't want to do Zoom college and spend a lot of money on that. And so that, I mean, if you could think of that being like, okay, there's a lot of deferred attainment kind of in the system. So now that it's no longer Zoom college, we get more people going back, and trying to do a degree that they would have done in the last couple of years had there not been a pandemic. I'm kind of surprised. I mean, that doesn't match my experience of the higher education institution where I work, where everyone's still hand wringing over the decline in enrollment, for better or worse. That's just
I'm very interested to see what happens, whether it's a persistent trend or it's just kind of an irregularity
right.
in the data.
If it's a deferred enrollment, you would expect okay, so then there's a hump and then it goes
hump. Yeah. That is yet to see. Yeah, yet to see that.
Well, seeing no other questions, I guess last call to our audience here. But I'm happy to just end this to say thank you so much, both of you, for presenting your amazing research. Thank you to everybody for joining. We will continue to do more of these over the coming year. We are really excited to have a pipeline of amazing scholarship coming from folks affiliated with SLLI. And thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Mike.